I'm Diane Macedo. We have breaking news. A U.S.-sponsored UN resolution calling for a ceasefire in the war in Gaza has failed. Russia and China vetoed the resolution that called for a pause in fighting to protect civilians and allow humanitarian aid to be delivered to more than 2 million hungry Palestinians. It all comes after a high-stakes meeting in Israel between the Secretary of State and the Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. Yesterday, Blinken said an Israeli ground invasion into Rafah would be a mistake and unnecessary. Netanyahu now says there is no way for us to defeat Hamas without going into Rafah, and I hope we will do with the support of the USA, but if we have to, we will do it alone. ABC News White House correspondent Karen Travers joins me now, along with Chief National Correspondent Matt Gutman from Tel Aviv. Matt, how significant are Netanyahu's remarks after Blinken blatantly discouraged this invasion of Rafah, as did President Biden?
They're significant in that Israel is making it absolutely clear that it is willing to go alone, that it is absolutely intending on pushing.
And we're going to go to the Secretary of State now speaking. Let's listen.
I also had a chance to meet with the hostage families again, and it's hard to describe what they're going through every single day. We've made progress in the last couple of weeks on the hostage negotiations, closing gaps, but almost by definition, when you get down to the last items, they tend to be the hardest. So there's still a lot of work to be done, hard work to be done, but we're determined to try to get it done. We also talked about the imperative of surging and sustaining humanitarian assistance for the people in Gaza. 100% of the population of Gaza is acutely food insecure. 100% is in need of humanitarian assistance. There have been some positive steps taken in recent days to improve the situation, but it's not enough. And we talked about what needs to happen to get much more assistance to many more people more effectively. We also talked about Rafah. We share Israel's goal of defeating Hamas, which is responsible for the worst massacre of the Jewish people since the Holocaust. And we share the goal of ensuring Israel's long-term security. As we've said, though, a major military ground operation in Rafah is not the way to do it. It risks killing more civilians. It risks wreaking greater havoc with the provision of humanitarian assistance. It risks further isolating Israel around the world and jeopardizing its long-term security and standing. So we're looking forward to having Israeli officials in Washington next week to talk about a different way of achieving these objectives that we share, of defeating Hamas and ensuring Israel's long-term security. It really requires an integrated humanitarian, military, and political plan. As I said, we'll be talking about that next week, going through the details of what we see as the best way forward. We also had an opportunity to talk about the longer-term trajectory. What needs to happen once the conflict in Gaza is over. Conversations that I had with our Arab partners over the last couple of days and that we had here in Israel as well. We're determined that Israel succeed in making sure it can defend itself, that October 7th never happens again, that it emerged from this strong, secure, integrated in the region with a future of security and peace, not only for Israelis, but for Palestinians and for our other friends in the region. And we believe there's a path forward to do that. We'll be continuing to work to flesh out that path and to try to walk down it in the days and weeks ahead.
Tamara? Mr. Secretary, thank you. Can you give us an update on the ceasefire talks in Doha? What is the latest that you've heard from the negotiators? And also today, Israel has announced a land seizure of 800 hectares in the occupied West Bank just when you are doing your visit here. What are your thoughts?
So on the negotiations, I can't give you any more details other than to say that we're intensely engaged in them, working with the Qataris, working with the Egyptians, working with Israel. And we have teams in Doha. And as I said, we've gotten it down to a few remaining gaps, but the closer you get to the goal line, the harder that last yard is. So there are some hard issues to work through. but we're determined to do everything we can to get there and to get people home. The negotiators will be working intensely to see if we can get that done. I hadn't seen the news you referred to, but look, you know our views on settlement expansion. You know our views on everything from demolitions to evictions to other steps, unilateral steps that are taken that make the already challenging prospect of two states even more distant. So I haven't seen the specifics of this, but anyone taking steps that makes things more difficult, more challenging this time, is something that we would have a problem with.
Tiny clarification, when you say we have teams, you mean U.S. has teams on the ground in Doha today, and can you just confirm the negotiations have begun, like they've been continuing this?
I can't, it should be going forward, if not immediately now, certainly in the hours ahead.
Michael, John? Thank you. Can you tell us in practical terms what the U.S. was trying to achieve with the resolution that was put forward at the United Nations today? And then on your conversations today, you described in broad strokes some themes that are familiar. I wonder whether you delivered or heard any messages today that are new and different from your past conversations here.
So on the resolution, which got very strong support, but then was cynically vetoed by Russia and China, I think we were trying to show the international community's sense of urgency about getting a ceasefire tied to the release of hostages, something that everyone, including the countries that vetoed the resolution, should have been able to get behind. The resolution, of course, also condemned Hamas. It's unimaginable why countries wouldn't be able to do that. But I think the fact that we got such a strong vote despite the veto by two of the permanent members of the Security Council, again, is evidence and demonstration of the commitment, the conviction of countries around the world, notably on the Security Council, to see about getting the ceasefire and getting the release of hostages now. That's what the resolution said. That's what it called for. And I think it showed that a strong commitment to that from many, many countries. With regard to the conversations we had, look, this is an ongoing process. As I said, we really were focused on three things: the hostage negotiations, humanitarian assistance, and Rafah. And it was important that, again, we focus on all three things. I'm not going to get into the details of what we discussed, but I think from my perspective at least, these were important, candid conversations to have at a critical time on all three of those issues.
Thanks. Israel that it will be isolated if it doesn't change its path?
Again, what I shared, and I think what they've heard from President Biden as well, directly, is we have the same goals: the defeat of Hamas, Israel's long-term security. But a major ground operation in Rafah is not, in our judgment, the way to achieve it. And we've been very clear about that. But most important, we have a senior team coming to Washington next week. We'll all be taking part in those discussions. We'll be able to lay out for them in detail. I started to do that today, but it's important that the teams with all the expertise lay out in detail how those goals can best be accomplished with an integrated humanitarian, military, and political plan. We'll put all that on the table. Of course, we'll hear from them too, and we'll take it to next week. Thanks.
That's Secretary of State Antony Blinken talking to reporters as he gets ready to leave Israel, about to take off there in Tel Aviv. He met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu while there in Israel, trying to urge Netanyahu not to launch a ground offensive into Rafah in southern Gaza. But the Prime Minister has responded saying there is no way to defeat Hamas without going into Rafah, and he is prepared to do it without U.S. support. I want to bring in our ABC News White House correspondent Karen Travers, along with Chief National Correspondent Matt Gutman, who's there in Tel Aviv. Matt, we heard Blinken say this again, that they share Israel's goal of defeating Hamas, but that he doesn't believe that invading Rafah is the way to do it. It doesn't seem that message, though, is getting through to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So now what?
We just heard something that was very interesting, right? The secretary elected to talk about that disagreement. And Diane, I can't remember, and as I was listening to him, I was trying to think when was the last time the two sides had a disagreement that was this significant, and they were dug in this much about, and it's been years and years. They are very far apart on this. Both of them are standing their ground. Nobody is budging, and this is going to be a major source of strife and this widening rift between Washington and Jerusalem, and this could last for some time. I don't know where this goes. What has become clear is that Israel is not going to budge. Israel is going to go into Rafah. It's going to be a big military operation. They are somehow going to try to move 1.4 million Palestinians to at least minimize, if they can, some of the humanitarian fallout that the U.S. is so terribly concerned about, as is the international community. But what is unclear is what the ramifications of this are going to be. The White House very rarely says, do this, we recommend this, do not go into Rafah. They are being public about it. They are being vocal about it. They couldn't be any more clear. And Israel is absolutely saying no. And we are willing to go alone. And we are willing to risk this most primary, essential relationship in order to go ahead with this offensive. This is really unusual in these relations, Diane.
Karen, Blinken's also placing a lot of importance on next week's meeting with the Israeli delegation going to Washington. What's at stake with that meeting?
Yeah, incredible significance there placed by the Secretary of State, talking about that meeting here in Washington next week between senior Israeli officials and senior Biden administration officials. You heard Secretary Blinken say that the U.S. and Israel share the same goals, even though they have these major disagreements about reaching those goals, defeating Hamas and ensuring the security of Israel. But Blinken was very clear that they're not budging in their opposition to this major ground operation in Rafah, and they believe there is a better way to do it. Blinken said he started to discuss that today with his meetings there in Israel with senior officials, including the prime minister. But he is waiting until next week because it's better to do it with that larger group, getting everybody around the table. And he was clear. He said that, they're going to talk about the better way forward, a different way forward, detailing that next week. They're not giving specifics, Diane, of what that's going to look like. But the administration is hoping that next week they can convince the Israelis to not go forward with that operation.
Matt, we also heard the Secretary of State refer to that failed resolution in the UN. The U.S. was proposing a ceasefire and a hostage deal that was vetoed by Russia and China. So what does that mean for the hostage negotiations now?
I think it's pretty clear that they are ongoing. The U.S., as the Secretary said, is putting a lot of eggs in that basket. CIA Director Bill Burns is in Doha right now. Israel's chief of the Mossad, the Foreign Intelligence Branch, is there as well. They are trying to hammer something out, but this really is a very complex negotiation. It would be a complex deal. Hamas wants to return, or is the putative deal would be for Hamas to return and release 40 living hostages in exchange for 700 to 1,000 Palestinians. And every one of them has to be vetted. They have to go through the list to see what their offenses were and if they can be released. So it really is a pretty taxing process, and that means weeks. A lot of the Palestinians who are in Gaza right now do not have weeks, according to the UN. People are starting to die now from the consequences of hunger. It's hard to die from hunger, easy to die from disease. And when your immunity is low from lack of nourishment, you are susceptible to the illnesses that we're seeing developing right now in Gaza. And that's what the UN is warning about. So if it takes a few more weeks or a month, that is going to be very bad for the hundreds of thousands of people who are suffering catastrophic hunger there right now, Diane.
Karen, how's the White House reacting to these latest comments from Netanyahu, this failed resolution, and what comes next?
Yeah, on the failed resolution, the administration is calling it a cynical and petty move by Russia and China to veto that resolution. And the U.S. ambassador to the UN says that they only vetoed it because it was written by the United States and that this was pure politics at play there. That was echoed by the Secretary of State saying that this was a cynical veto. But you heard Blinken say that the conversations continue and the gaps are closing, but they're not there yet. And as he put it, to put it in sports terms, they're on the last goal. They're on the goal line there, but it's that final yard that sometimes is the hardest to achieve, and that right now there are still some significant differences. But this was an attempt by the United States at the UN to reach a ceasefire, show the urgency of that, while also condemning Hamas. But they say that move by Russia and China was cynical.